Welcome in, ladies and gentlemen. A few episodes ago, I introduced you guys to what a social entrepreneur is and the social impact that something of those endeavors can reach. Today, I have on Tom Kovach. Tom is a social impact. I don't even know if I'd say entrepreneur, man. This guy has a huge list of things that he's involved in the nonprofit sector. So give me a second while I read off this list. Tom is the executive director of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department Foundation, the executive director at Project Real. He is the president of his own company, DonorBasis LLC, the board of directors of the United Way of Southern Nevada, president of Dignity Health St. Rose Foundation, the president of the board of trustees of the Nevada School of Art, and he is on the national board of directors of the Human Rights Campaign. Tom, I'm honored to be sitting across someone who has created such a magnificent social impact on society, and I'm honored to talk with you.
Thank you for having me.
So as I mentioned, this is quite a long list. So I think the best way that we could kind of tackle this is just kind of start in the beginning. So let's just give us some context of who Tom Kovach is growing up, and just kind of how you were growing up, and if your mindset and social impact that you've created now was similar to your youth.
Sure. I think there's probably three elements to my youth that sort of propelled me to what I'm doing now. The first are my parents. I really have not ever met two more generous people than my mom and dad. They've been really great to me. I don't have any siblings, so all their attention was directed at me. And I saw them from my young age giving back to their community. One of the earliest memories I have of my mom's engagement was she was the local chairwoman of our United Way campaign where we were living at the time. And that has motivated my engagement with United Way as an adult. My dad went to West Point. He was in the Army for 5 years, did 2 terms in Vietnam, and then left the Army after I was born. And a lot of our movement in my earlier years was because of his transition from military to civilian life. And we never really were in one place long enough for me to have a sense of community. And that has reminded me of the importance of being part of a community and wanting to make the community I'm living in as strong as it possibly can be. And then 2 other things. The second one, I have a really strong memory of protecting people. My parents had friends who had a son who, for whatever reason, was frequently bullied. And I, on more than one occasion, intervened, sometimes to my detriment, but it was a factor for me in my development and my youth, because I saw my parents helping people and I wanted to do and felt compelled to do the same. And then the last thing of my youth that I think is relevant to what I do, and you reference sort of the entrepreneurial side of it. Most people think entrepreneurial from a business standpoint. And we were living in a house when I was in elementary school that bordered woods, that bordered a golf course. And I somehow figured out that if I went into the woods and collected golf balls that the golfers had lost, I could set up a stand on the side of the road leading up to the golf course and sell them back the golf balls they lost. And I made money and bought my first set of clubs. And that sort of just triggered this entrepreneurial sense in me. But it never really has materialized from a capitalistic standpoint. I've just spent a lot of time throughout my career. It's been almost entirely dedicated to helping nonprofits and focused on that piece of the entrepreneurship than, the money-making side.
Yeah. Yeah. The reason why I brought up entrepreneurship is exactly to your point. It's heavily identified as capitalistic and income generating revenue. But you can be entrepreneurial in other endeavors, because an entrepreneur is somebody who just wants to create value at the end of the day. You want to add something to society that wasn't there and didn't exist, and then it has some sort of impact on society. And I mentioned in the beginning that you started your own company, DonorBasis LLC, correct?
That's correct.
From what I gather, it sounds like it's kind of like a nonprofit startup incubator in a sense. Would that be the correct way to classify that?
Sure. I haven't used that term. Sounds good to me.
Can you just expand on what DonorBasis is?
Right. So it's a company I started several years ago to basically assist nonprofits, but nonprofits who are small and are looking to grow. So from that standpoint, it's definitely entrepreneurial. It's definitely increasing these nonprofits' impact in the community. And the main way they're going to do that is by raising more money, right? Having more resources or having stronger partnerships with other organizations, having more volunteers, a stronger board of directors, bringing resources, time, talent, and treasure to these nonprofits. And so I think you're spot on from the way you described it. I've never described it that way myself.
Yeah, it's a start, because startup incubators are growing in popularity just because of how many entrepreneurs are beginning to butt up in society. We're kind of migrating from this business person mentality to this entrepreneurial mindset over the last maybe 20 years or so. And you see people like Gary Vee and Mark Cuban and some of these people that are kind of pioneering that, to show that you can start multiple companies and you could be in the forefront of what your company is doing, and you can be available to questions and being highly accessible. That's kind of like what an entrepreneur represents. And from DonorBasis, it's like, when I read about it and then read off all the accolades that you're doing, I was like, it makes perfect sense that it's some sort of nonprofit startup incubator in a sense. Is when you started DonorBasis, was it because you realized that a lot of these nonprofits were missing something? Were they lacking leadership, capital, funds to start up? What was kind of the reasoning to start this?
So I had been doing work for a large company that was helping nonprofits around the country and in Europe. I spent a lot of time in the UK, helping mostly large universities and higher education institutions start a development or a fundraising program, because it's something that has been happening here for centuries. But in most of the rest of the world, philanthropy isn't as active historically as it has been here. And so what I wanted to do is, one, stop traveling all the time for work and help where I live, right? I moved here in 96, and so this is home. And so I decided I was going to focus on nonprofits in Southern Nevada, and for the most part, small nonprofits. And I think the most important attribute I'm trying to bring to the organizations I work with is to think about them as businesses and not as a nonprofit. The whole idea that if you're a nonprofit, you can't make money is the antithesis to what these nonprofits really need. They need to be seen as generators of revenue and other resources so that they can further their mission. And I've been amazed by how many very successful business people who are asked to serve on boards of nonprofit organizations end up saying yes, but then thinking they have to view the world differently when they walk into the nonprofit boardroom as compared to how they think if they're in a for-profit company's boardroom. And the way we measure nonprofits versus the way we measure for-profits is dramatically different. On the for-profit side, you think of any list, whether it's a Fortune list or a Forbes list or anyone else's list, those lists are based on revenue. We rank companies based on the amount of money they bring into their company. Well, when you look at nonprofits, historically, they've been measured by their budget. They're not being measured by how much money they raise. They're being measured by how much money they spend. And when you start to look at the world as an expense rather than revenue, you're going to be drawn to different reactions and, unfortunately, too often different decisions. You'll be less likely to take risks. And that the foundation of any successful enterprise is risk. Mm-hmm. You have to be willing to take risk to build the brand, whether that's for-profit or nonprofit. You have to take risk to go out and seek capital or seek funding to grow your organization and have greater impact. And I have attempted through the company that I started and through all the work I do as a volunteer on nonprofit boards to try to help these nonprofits take on more risk, right, so that they can do more good in the world.
Huh. And I never realized that nonprofits were measured in expenses. That seems like a massive barrier in preventing what could be created. Are you familiar with what a B Corp is?
No.
So I just had on Silo Moses that I mentioned earlier. I guess it's kind of like a happy medium between nonprofits and for-profits, and you kind of have to work your way into it. He founded Serving Hope LV, and basically the story behind him is he was homeless, and then once he got off the streets, he started like a kind of like a food distribution area where homeless people could come in and eat and serve. And it was originally a nonprofit, and then you could work your way into this status, which is, it's like, it would be just like it's classified as like a LLC or a 501c3. It's called a B Corp. And I guess they just added this into Nevada over the last 2 or 3 years. And there's companies like Ben & Jerry's and Tom Shoes that are classified as B Corps. And so you can basically act as a nonprofit, but you could get some tax benefits as well. And it's like a new classification to try to bridge the privatization and nonprofit, because we all know privatization increases optimization, as that's why profits are generally ranked. And then in the nonprofit sector, it seems like if it's an expense, if it's viewed or ranked by expenses, it seems like it's heavily reliant on donations, correct?
Correct.
So it seems like people are trying to tackle that as well, but that's something that Silo just turned me on to a few weeks ago.
There's an opportunity for almost every nonprofit to create a fee-for-service revenue stream, mm-hmm. which is, I think, getting at
similar, yeah.
Bringing up. And I think that's a missed opportunity too many nonprofits don't try to take advantage of. You know, what are they doing in their mission that they could, in addition to the traditional ways of bringing capital to the organization, find ways to have people, not necessarily their clients all the time, but people or other entities, the government as an example, pay for the services. And so I think it's a great model, and one that hopefully more nonprofits will look at.
Do you generally take on, you said in the beginning you mentioned that you generally work with smaller, with DonorBasis you generally work with smaller nonprofits. Is that because you want to get in on the ground early to help build this nonprofit with, I guess you'd say, strong support structures, rather than kind of how these nonprofits have been growing over the last years, but measuring with expenses kind of builds like a faulty foundation?
Well, what motivates me is the mission. And so I have had the opportunity to work with some of the largest nonprofits in the world. But it's almost more gratifying to help an organization that's just starting or has been quite small for whatever period of time and see significant exponential growth in a relatively short period of time. Cleveland Clinic was a client of mine for many years, and I thought I was doing some good work for them, but at the end of the day, I'm sure most people didn't really realize, because they were so big and the area of work I was helping them with was relatively small compared to the overall enterprise. But now you take the Police Foundation, we've been able to take an organization that was at most in any given year raising $200,000 to the last 2 years, we've raised over $8 million each year. And that's within a time period of 5 or 6 years. And to me, that's more gratifying to see the impact of my time and efforts and the time and efforts of our team that we've built up, be able to do that.
Yes, you're sort of, in a sense, you're embracing the startup culture. Identify with that mindset as well. As we were talking before we started recording, I've been involved in a few startups because I feel like my impact can travel farther than in some of these exact corporations where there's so many checks and balances and hoops and ladders you could go through that the delays extend months on end, and sometimes you just hit a snag in what you can do.
Absolutely. I hate bureaucracy.
So let's actually extend on the Metro Police Department Foundation, as you were mentioning. The thing that I had written down, I said that the foundation's a nonprofit that raises funds to support programs and initiatives that bridge the divide between law enforcement and the community. There are some things that include youth programming, training, and community events. Why do you think why is this exact quote their statement, bridging law enforcement and the community? Is there a disparity growing between them? What is the exact idea behind that?
So the original idea was bridging the concept that you could have a public entity like a law enforcement agency, and in this case specifically a police department, that could receive private funding to help further its mission, in part to build a stronger relationship between the police department and the community it serves. Here in Nevada, we don't have as many examples of private foundations set up historically to support public institutions. The best examples are the two foundations that support UNR or UNLV. But you go to more established communities, in the Midwest or the East Coast, and you'll see historically foundations set up to support libraries. And we actually have one here, but most people don't know it exists. We see a lot of examples around the country of the opportunity for an entity to be established to raise funds for a public entity. And so the first example or aspect of divide is exactly that. Most people living here don't realize that there's a way for them to support their local police department in this way. And so that's the first divide that we're looking to minimize. So we want to educate residents here that they want a safer community. They want to support public safety, their own safety, that they have an opportunity to do that through the LVMPD Foundation. So that's the first sort of way of looking at this divide issue. And then we can start looking at it, as we do, in ways that build stronger connections between a law enforcement agency, in this case Metro, and the community or communities they serve. And that can be through providing opportunities for the public to have a better understanding of law enforcement, and more importantly, the people of law enforcement. I mean, one of the goals of the foundation is to help the public, either recognize or remind them that the people behind the badge are real people, that they have interests and talents and struggles and challenges just like everyone else does. And we want to sort of put, if you will, a human element, humanize the badge, because far too often the only relationship or knowledge that the public has of police officers is what's portrayed in the media or what's portrayed in television shows or movies or other types of media that's focused on certain aspects of law enforcement, which historically and traditionally tends to be, the most exciting elements, SWAT and crime scenes and things like that. And we, as a foundation, want to help the public recognize that our officers are moms and dads, they're sons and daughters, they're brothers and sisters, they're neighbors. And by showing them, meaning the public, that these officers are real people, hopefully there'll be a stronger bond between the public and the officers who are out to protect them.
Yeah, it seems like that divide has been growing and exacerbated because of the media. The media likes to focus on one event that's happened in a country of over 300 million people and kind of just create that blemish and just throw it as the overall, I guess, face of what the police department is, right? And so that was the first thought that came to mind when I was reading it. But we all know how valuable the police are, right? We saw over the course of 2020 a lot of defund the police campaigns, and now in those places where there was those campaigns or were those campaigns, we're seeing police budgets actually increase because of the crime and different things that have happened and the necessity for it. So I mentioned a few different type of community events that you guys are offering. How do you plan to build, or I guess bridge back that divide between law enforcement and the media and the community that's been exacerbated by the media?
Right. So you're pointing out the sort of third element of the divide, which is looking at the divide between communities that have historically been marginalized by law enforcement. And that's a big statement, but it is true. And the police department. And that was clearly, illustrated by the response that a lot of communities took to incidents last year. And yes, the media is covering that. That's front and center. Anytime you're going to more than likely portray images of conflict, it's going to unfortunately rise to the top of news outlets. It's just what draws attention and what people tend to pay attention to.
Yeah, fear-mongering sells, unfortunately.
So what we're looking to do is really support the police department's efforts to bridge those divides. And we're very fortunate as a foundation that we support a police foundation that has been progressive in many, many ways. It starts with the approach that the police department has taken to a use of force policy and ensuring that their policy is one that is appropriate and advanced so that they have the opportunity to then train officers on that policy in a approach of de-escalation to try to minimize the use of force and minimize the harm to the officers and to anyone else involved in a situation. And when you have the opportunity as a foundation to start from that perspective, we have a great advantage that perhaps other foundations or other entities supporting law enforcement in different parts of the country don't have. So the things that we're able to do to a greater degree and are looking to do to a greater degree going forward is really funding community engagement opportunities by the police department and the public in general, but very importantly, communities that have had a less than positive history with law enforcement historically and have felt marginalized, not only in general by society, but by law enforcement. And so the police department has put together some pretty interesting and exciting opportunities for the officers to engage with communities of color, and in particular youth. Because when you start to look at attitudes towards law enforcement, the younger populations tend to be less positive and more skeptical. And so if we can help younger people, children, young adults, teenagers, have a better relationship and a better understanding with law enforcement and of the fact that law enforcement is here to help me, not just harm me in my perspective, in that youth's perspective. Mm-hmm. We're going to be much better off not only today, but going forward on so many levels. So one of the programs is our youth sports, right? We fund a little league that the department started, and officers serve as the coaches of that league. We fund a soccer league, and we fund a hockey league. Now, over the last 12 months, there's been less activity, especially with the hockey league because of COVID and social distancing and gathering restrictions. But over the last few years, since the Little League started, there has been an 86% decrease in year-over-year violent crime in the neighborhoods around where the games are played, which is a pretty compelling statistic that this program is working. This program is working on several levels. One, it's giving youth who might otherwise most likely have a lot of idle time. And unfortunately, if you're young and don't have anything to do, you might find yourself getting into trouble. So it gives them something constructive to do. They go to practice, they go to games. And in some cases, that helps keep them in school. They'll graduate from high school. Whether or not they go on to college, at least they've graduated and they have a skill set and a degree that they can help themselves get a job, and again, prevent being put in a situation where crime seems more interesting. But it's also bringing the communities together. So during practices, the families of the players are coming together. During games, the families are coming together, neighbors are coming together. And so they're giving all of themselves less time to be idle and more time to be together, forming bonds, not only with law enforcement, with themselves. And if you have greater pride in your community, if you know your neighbors better than not, you're more than likely going to have more respect for your community and less likely to do something to harm it, and also be more likely to want to protect it. And so when a crime might occur, you'll be more likely to work with law enforcement to try to help the police find who committed the crime. Whereas before this program, before these community bonds had been developed and before a stronger relationship with law enforcement had been fostered, you might not have been willing to share a tip or some other type of assistance to the police because you felt marginalized or you were scared of them. You thought you wouldn't be treated well. And so through this time-worn tradition of Little League baseball, the police department has found a tremendous way to help build a better relationship with a particular geographic community. And because of the high proportion of people of color who live in that community with a community of color, as well as help reduce violent crime significantly in that community.
Sports are probably the best way to harmonize a lower middle class area and a community. I grew up on the east side of Vegas as well. So many of the students who attended SHOP where I graduated had, how do I describe this? They weren't fond of the police, and even translated to the school police. And the reason why I can acknowledge that is because of the amount of fights that were in the school, and the way that the students would also try to fight campus police. It was oftentimes misrepresented because of how the media's kind of chastised it. But I think sports and bridging that community bond is very important. Has the foundation looked into, I guess, marketing or creating different things on the internet through these digital communities? As we know, like social media has kind of dominated the last 10 years of ways for youth to communicate. And now with remote working and some of these other internet trends that are growing, it might be even tougher to get some of these less privileged communities together. Have you guys looked into any of these digital communities and how to kind of engage with them?
So the foundation itself hasn't. The police department could. I don't know everything that's going on in the department. But one of the other organizations that you referenced earlier, Project Real, is looking at that type of communication to engage youth. That organization that is often working in tandem with law enforcement, using police officers as volunteers, again, as a way to put police officers in a non-threatening environment in front of youth so that they can see that a police officer can be my friend. They don't just have to be a perceived foe. But Project Real has looked at how do we engage young people in a dialogue about not only their responsibilities under the law, but also their rights under the law. So as to create a platform for them to have a better understanding of the law, therefore have more respect for the law and be less likely to break it, but also hopefully to be more engaged in their communities going forward as they become adults, more civically minded, as an example, that they vote, right? Because they feel that it makes a difference. And so we're using technology, whether it's through an app or through online programming, to not just teach young people what the law is, but to get them to talk about it, have a discussion, have a debate, own it, so that they feel more compelled to abide by it and want to be a better person, however they define that. But if we can get young people to agree to that premise, that if I want to be better, that means I need to avoid doing certain things, and have knowledge of aspects of the law that I didn't even know exist, that what I just did would be considered trespassing. And, I think nothing breeds distrust than being told of something after the fact. Our goal is to get in front of it, to allow them to have a better understanding that this is right, this is wrong, this is what the law says, but we want you to feel like you own that it's as much your law as it is anyone else's law.
Law is intimidating. I mean, it's literally hundreds and hundreds of pages, and we learn about different variations of the law and learn about it oftentimes after the fact. Unfortunately, after you've been in trouble or you've been given a ticket or issued a citation for whatever it was that you were breaking, right? The majority of us don't even read the terms of service whenever we sign up something, put our name on the dotted line. It's just like, it's what do they call it? Like just law gibberish or legal speak, right? Oftentimes the laws and these different contracts are worded in such a way that makes it almost impossible to comprehend unless you have some sort of specific knowledge tied to that. So having youthful communities engaging in conversations surrounding what their legal protections are, or what their legal rights are, I think is an ingenious idea for Project Real to actively engage in, especially with the growth of things like Clubhouse and Twitter, where these conversations are needed regardless of whether some of the platforms are a little bit more aggressive, I guess would be the way to put it. But I think social media is probably the most prominent place to kind of display these different tactics.
Right. And you referenced the fact that we're beginning to return to work and school outside of our homes. And so Project Real has just launched a Return Ready campaign that's focused on sort of the top laws that young people might break accidentally because they don't know it's wrong to do certain things. And our goal is to take a guide, a conversational guide, and get it into the hands of as many parents as possible so that they can be having these conversations with their children as their children return to school or return to summer, when as parents are returning to work, there's going to be a lot less supervision or adult presence at home, more like it was in 2019 before the pandemic. And so this is another example of trying to get out in front of the opportunity for these young people to do something wrong without knowing it. So we're less focused in this guide for conversation about, stealing is wrong. I think most young people would acknowledge that. But again, if you start looking at other types of activity that they might engage in, again, trespassing or something like that, that they don't realize they're actually breaking the law, we are hoping that this opportunity for the young people initially to have conversations with their parents will have multiple benefits, but one of them will be to make them better prepared to return to something resembling what we used to call normal.
The new normal. So what exactly is Project Real?
So Project Real is a nonprofit that was founded 15 years ago by two community stalwarts. One who unfortunately passed away last year, Erwin Molaski, who's developed so much of the city. He was responsible for providing the land where UNLV was originally built. He's created a number of institutions, from hospitals to hospice, to a lot of the older apartment, condo, office buildings throughout the valley. And his good friend, Sam Lionel, who has had a storied legal career, and tomorrow, I believe, turns 102.
Wow.
Decided 15 years ago. So, Sam was in his 80s.
The 80s.
Erwin was in his 70s, that they wanted to make their community even better by improving access for young people to law-related education. Again, the same things we were talking about earlier. Because they saw an increase of crime by young people. They saw a decrease in the amount of time children in public school were being taught civics or anything law-related. And so they envisioned a nonprofit that would bridge that gap, a nonprofit that could provide a curriculum, provide programming directed at young people that would help them have, again, a better understanding of the law, their rights and responsibilities, giving them a platform to have more respect for it, be less likely to break it, and creating a safer community for themselves and all of us. And so Project Real over time has developed a number of aspects to a sequential education program that basically starts in kindergarten and can go all the way to 12th grade, that range from field trips to the courthouses for children and students who live near one. So most of our work in that regard is done in Clark County and in Washoe County. So we'll either go to the courthouses in Las Vegas or in Reno. And we give young people the opportunity to witness a live trial, to experience a court process without having to be the subject of it. And it's eye-opening and has a lot of positive benefits. I don't want to be in that chair ever, so I'm going to be a better person. Or, wow, I didn't even know that job existed. I might aspire to be a judge or a lawyer or a court administrator, some element of the process. And we also allow them to have Q&A sessions with judges and other court officials that help them start to realize that these people who probably up to that point they've only seen on a screen, and they have this concept that this person is there to send you to jail, when in reality, that's not the case. And if we can, just like we're doing with the Police Foundation or other Project Real programming, have police officers in non-threatening environments in front of young people, these court field trips allow other law enforcement or other agents of the law and legal system to be put in non-threatening environments in front of these young people.
Kind of want to add on what a non-threatening environment is, because it's a little bit subjective, because people can feel threatened in various ways depending on what you're familiar with, right? Like if you're just stepping outside of your comfort bubble, everything could seem threatening because it's just such a new environment to you. How do you guys classify a non-threatening environment?
It's first and foremost an environment in which the young person isn't the object of or the subject of the engagement. So in the case of going to a courthouse and a judge says to a teenager or an elementary school student or a middle school student, come sit in my chair. I'm leaving this place that young person probably only sees as a place of authority and power, because anything that they've probably seen about a court is a judge sentencing someone to something. And that's a pretty powerful position to be in. So if a young person can say, okay, I'm going to go sit in this chair, I'm going to be behind this gavel and feel like the judge feels, that is non-threatening, right? I'm not the object of this. I'm actually getting to sit where the person with power and authority sits. And for whatever brief moment of time, that young person can feel, well, I have a seat at the table too. I'm worthy of this. And hopefully that will compel them to have a better understanding of that role, the role of authority, the role that law plays in all of our lives, which fundamentally is there to help our lives be better. And we do pre and post questionnaires, testing, if you will, where we're less interested in the knowledge of how that courtroom operates, and more interested in the effect that experience had on those students. And we have a very strong track record where like almost 80% of the students who go through one of these experiences will report that they want to be a better person. They're going to do something to change if they need to change, or they're just going to be committed to continuing to be, in their minds, a good person or want to improve. And then, quite frankly, I don't know if we can have a better impact than that. But that's how I would define non-threatening, right? Putting these young people in a place where they're not feeling threatened by the person or position of authority.
Okay, yeah. So, and then when you're putting them in these non-threatening environments, you're really turning the switch from fear, because if you're in a threatening environment, you're generally fearful, and then you're migrating it over to inspiration in a sense, right? If that student or youthful kid is sitting in the judge's chair. They could eventually become inspired to make a change or even pursue that as a profession and a career. That seems to be one of the big draws or magnets for educating somebody, right? The more you know about one issue or one subject, the more likely you are to become more attracted and want to become affiliated with whatever you're kind of gaining some knowledge towards.
Right. So it's initially an inspiration, and it then becomes motivation. I want to, do things that will help me achieve that.
Does Project Real collect stats since it's been over 15 years, or kind of, I guess, follow these kids around or follow up on different questionnaires every few years to kind of have a little bit more of a statistical analytic standpoint towards the success of some of these programs?
So that's exactly the direction we're going in. So historically, no, because we see these students for, say, a field trip, and then we won't see them ever again. That's due to the fact that the organization is still relatively small, and the type of programming we're providing hasn't been integrated into the broader school curriculum to ensure that there's a touch point that takes place more than once. So ultimately our goal, and this is a big goal, it'll take a while to get there, but we would very much want to have all students at each grade level interact with one of our programs. And we've designed 12 years of programming to do that so that we can do a number of things. I think anytime you have repetitive engagement, you're going to see greater impact from that engagement, but also to do exactly what you've referenced so that we can track the impact over the school career of these young people.
Yeah, the growing necessity for statistical analytics is growing, right? They always say that data is the new oil. Data's probably overtaken it if you're able to actually commodify it. But understanding the direction of where students are headed is very important. And there's another one of your affiliations that I'd like to discuss because I'm very curious on. I said you were on the National Board of Directors of the Human Rights Campaign. Human rights has been in the spotlight for decades, and it's grown from the MLK movement to women rights. I've had on a woman named Jazz Appen, who's leading one of the sex worker rights movements out here. What is your role within the Human Rights Campaign specifically?
So the Human Rights Campaign is the largest civil rights organization in the country focused on LGBTQ equality and equity. And my role has been to serve on the National Board of Directors. So as an organization, we're headquartered in Washington, D.C., in the seat of federal government. At its beginning, the organization was essentially a political fund to help raise money to change the hearts and minds of legislators, first and foremost in Washington, Congress, to pass laws that were friendlier, protective of LGBTQ people. Over time, the organization realized that if we were going to influence those lawmakers, we had to do more than just lobby them while they were in session. And when legislation that affected us came to the floor or was coming to committee, we realized that we had to change the hearts and minds of society. And so the organization started to invest quite heavily in non-political work that would change attitudes of people where they engaged every day. And we started in corporate America. And so the organization created a scorecard for companies to self-evaluate their policies and procedures as they affected their LGBTQ employees or their LGBTQ customers and the LGBTQ community in general. That has become known as the Corporate Equality Index and has become the leading measurement of corporate support for LGBTQ people in the country, and we've actually now started to take it abroad. But we also have created similar scorecards in healthcare, in long-term aging care, at the state level and the municipal level, to help other entities that have great sway over people's attitudes as well as policies and laws that have an impact on LGBTQ people, so that they too can be scored and they too can be motivated, sort of what we were talking about earlier, creating an inspiration. Whether you're a government or a person, you want to be better. You want to be high on the list, not low on the list. And so creating these scorecards allowed us to get corporate America's attention first and foremost, and now other elements and sectors of our society, their attention to the need to improve. But we also realized that the more people who are among the LGBTQ community identified that way, like we're comfortable being out at work, out at school, out at their place of worship, out in their neighborhood, the more impact we were going to have on affecting those lawmakers. Because it is very easy to vote or support a candidate or a law that's going to discriminate, or I should say, at least it's easier to do that if you're not affecting someone you know. And so over the last many years, the organization just celebrated its 40th anniversary. Fundamentally what we are trying to do is change hearts and minds so that LGBTQ people feel safer in any aspect of their lives, and therefore will be healthier. And that's happening, fortunately, all over the country. It's happening here in Nevada. In fact, this state is certainly one of the more progressive states when it comes to laws passed by, or at least at the state level. And the gaming sector has been very supportive, and not only of their employees, but of their customer base. And so, my role originally was to help form a local, what we call community of the Human Rights Campaign here in Las Vegas. I helped lead that effort, and then I became engaged with the organization at the national level, and for the last several years have served on the board of directors.
When it comes to the LGBTQ community, would you say that the biggest obstacle they're facing is coming from the bottom up approach or the top down? And what I mean by that is the discrimination or oppression or whatever classification you want to call it. Is it coming from everyday normal people, like just the workers and communities of a city, or is it coming from the top approach of lawmakers and corporations and people in a position of power?
It's both. There's a number of examples of lawmakers passing laws that harm LGBTQ people, or at least create a platform for greater harm to LGBTQ people. Fortunately, at the federal level, that's happening less and less. And in many states, it's not an issue, but in too many states, it remains an issue. In 24 states, I believe you can still get married on a Sunday and have your employer fire you on Monday because you married someone of the same sex. Well, that's not protective, and that's why passing the Equality Act, which is before Congress currently, is so important. So there's the top-down aspect. But the bottom up aspect remains, unfortunately, equally as harmful potentially, because the harm to LGBTQ people, especially trans women of color, is alarming. I mean, it's just, it has to stop. And the injury or death to these people, these humans, while there is protection, unfortunately, in too many cases under the law, it's happening because residents just like them are doing harm to them. So it's difficult for me to say it's one over the other. It's important to address both. And even in 2021, it's unfortunate that we still need to do that. And that's in part been driven by the fact that we have had so much success in moving the needle of protection, both at the top, both from a legislative standpoint or a court standpoint, but also from the bottom, the general public, having a much greater acceptance of LGBT people than ever before. But still today, we need to do so much more.
Are there any LGBTQ communities, movements, or activists that you see gaining a lot of steam out here in the city or making way towards paving this movement in the positive direction?
So there's a lot of good work taking place. There's an organization called Silver State Equality, which is led by Andre Wade. And he's committed his entire career to advancing the safety of marginalized people. And for the last several years, either while he was executive director of the LGBTQ Center, the center, or now as executive director of Silver State Equality, he's very much focusing on people with HIV and ensuring that they're protected, decriminalizing aspects that still exist on the books and statute of Nevada that would, potentially, again, going back to what we talked about earlier, because you don't know something is illegal, you engage in it because it's natural, and then you find out that you could be criminalized for it. To the center, at this point, moving into a space it's never provided programming and services, which is expanded health and wellness services to include a pharmacy, to allow people who need medication within the community, especially medication that can help that person either live with HIV, AIDS, or prevent getting it. But perhaps they're unable to access those medications because of cost or other barriers, is a huge step for the center and a huge step for our movement within the LGBT community locally.
Yeah, it's such a heavy topic because you feel like equality should be just popularized everywhere. And sometimes our own ignorance pushes us in that direction because of, subconscious thoughts or past experiences or anything under the sun that you're just not even aware of. But I think one of the simple things that many of us could do is just be a shoulder to lean on or just have conversations, right? It's like we're all equal at the end of the day, even outside of the LGBTQ community. Down here in the Arts District in downtown, homelessness is fairly present. And Silo, who I had on, the social entrepreneur, was homeless for 7 months. And I asked him, how do we help homeless people? And he was like, honestly, just having a conversation with them. Like, just, you feel so dissociated from society because you've been so marginalized, whether you're LGBTQ, somebody who's marginalized, homelessness, and that you feel so lonely because you said homeless people will go months without even having without even having a conversation with somebody. And then that kind of becomes like a self-cascading wormhole into depression and sometimes, unfortunately, to suicide, things like that. So I think just simple conversations of just talking with somebody and hearing them out sometimes paves a pathway to an individual's freedom from oppression or even self-doubt.
That's right. I mean, there's nothing more powerful than a conversation. And it goes both ways, right? It is unfortunate how much time and energy society gives and takes to identify an enemy rather than taking the time to have a conversation that it doesn't necessarily need to develop into a friendship, but it creates a bond and looks at someone for the common ground rather than the difference. And I agree completely with you. If we could take that approach rather than the approach that's too often taken, that we're, creating these silos among like people and viewing and emphasizing the differences of other people, we'd all be better off.
Right. Social impact. The first word is social, right? You have to understand one another and create this self-inclusive or all-inclusive environment that makes individuals feel comfortable to express themselves without having the fear of receiving backlash, whether it's actual physical violence or mental violence or some sort of power repression over that person or power exertion, I guess you could say, because I know that's a common oppressive tactic is taking somebody who has a position of power and kind of exerting that, whether it's through like blackmail or if it's in a corporate work structure, holding a promotion over someone's head to do something for you. Like there's so many different tactics to it that we're not even aware of because of just sometimes ignorance, because you're just not really aware of it. I had a gentleman on, his name was Stretch Sanders. He led the 6,000 person BLM peaceful protests back in, I think this was in like May. It was at like the Kiange Sake Palacio Park. It was like 6,000 people. And he was saying that one of the biggest oppressive tactics towards people of color is actually just ignorance, not even realizing that the way that you speak or the way that you engage with an individual can come off racist just because you're not aware. So education is probably one of the best proponents as we kind of like circle this entire conversation together. Educating is very important to creating that equality, egalitarian style world.
Right. And it's bringing people together. There's just still too much segregation, whether that's based on race or gender or orientation. That to me is equally important and is a role of education, right? To bring people together, to put people in contact with people who aren't necessarily just like them.
Before we get out of here, are there any upcoming events between the Police Department Foundation or Project Real or any of these other nonprofits that you sit on the board in the city that you'd like to mention or that you see can have some sort of impact moving forward?
So the Return Ready campaign for Project Real, I think, is one opportunity. We're working with elected officials and corporate leaders to help parents know that this material is available to them, and be able to have conversations that will ideally lead to a safer reentry for their children into the return to the summer, to school, but also will hopefully help those young people understand, as we talked about earlier, that these laws are there to protect them, not prohibit them from being the person they want to be. So it's not a physical event, but it's social media. It's an opportunity for people to engage still within the guidelines of social distancing. So I that's definitely one to highlight. The other events that the foundation is planning, there are opportunities for people to come out and support the organization. We're doing a golf tournament in May, and doing another sort of in-person dinner gathering later in May. And we'll have other programming around different aspects of helping the public understand the human nature of the badge and the people who wear the badge. So whether that's an opportunity to celebrate the incredible contributions of women in law enforcement and on the police department. We do a annual luncheon. This year it'll be in September. And then for the police department, our biggest event will come up in November. That will allow the officers during COVID and outside of it, because we'll be recognizing officers from prior to the pandemic for some incredibly heroic efforts to keep us safe. And they'll be presented medals by the sheriff at the annual Best of the Badge Gala.
I have one final question for you. Same question I ask all of my guests. What does Las Vegas mean to you?
Home.
Beautifully put. Simple. Where do I send all of the listeners and viewers to get involved with you, follow you on social media, any of these campaigns or links that you'd like to mention?
They can go to LVMPD Foundation, that hashtag, Project Real, NV, Return Ready.
Perfect. Tom, thank you for coming on. This is a very insightful conversation. It's very deep, but these are some of the heavy topics that we have to talk about in order to create awareness and educate others that the law is there to help you. The officers are there to help. And even in times of animosity, there's more common ground than there is negative.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
It was my pleasure. Thank you guys for listening, and we will catch you next time.